move on to the fourth paper. So the fourth paper is the missing home buyers, regional heterogeneity, and credit contractions. The presenter is Pierre Mabille. Sorry if I did not pronounce your name correctly, but the floor is yours for 30 minutes.
All right, thank you very much, Wenlan. I'm very happy to present what was my job market paper from last year, actually. I'm now at INSEAD in the finance area. So the motivation for this paper is the unprecedented decrease in young homeownership that happened since the Great Recession, which sort of dramatically amplified a 40-year-old trend by which young homeownership had been falling. So this decrease, which represents more than 5 million missing purchases, almost 15 to 20 million missing home buyers, is much more than mean reversion from the housing boom. It's a persistent drop below the pre-boom level. Therefore, it's been a major concern for policymakers and the mortgage sector. As you can see on the graph, the probability for a 25 to 44-year-old household to be a homeowner in 2015, so for those households who entered the housing market during the Great Recession, is 20% lower than for the same age group in 2005. In contrast, it's been essentially unchanged for older households. These first-time buyers represent almost 50% of all purchase mortgages in the US, and they're targeted by many policies, like the first-time home buyer credit, to which I will come back. Therefore, this decrease is absolutely a first-order phenomenon if you want to understand housing markets, not only now, but also going forward, because these missing buyers from today are the missing homeowners from tomorrow, the people who will not accumulate housing wealth towards retirement in particular. However, while we know a lot about foreclosures, that is, while we know a lot about exit from homeownership, we know a lot less about missing entry or delayed entry into homeownership. In particular, we don't know whether this decrease should be attributed to what is a time effect, that is characteristics of the post-Great Recession period with tight credit markets, lack of housing affordability, and or whether it should be attributed to characteristics of the millennial cohort itself, which, as we know, is loaded with student debt, entered the housing market during the Great Recession with potentially persistent negative effects on their earnings or scarring, and which we know also tend to prefer locating in expensive locations. It's important to disentangle all these effects because they have very different implications for housing markets, in particular in terms of persistence, whether it's a time effect that will potentially mean revert, or whether it's a cohort effect that will potentially be more persistent, and also for the implications of stimulus policies. So the goal of this paper is to sort of expand our knowledge about these missing home buyers by asking what the causes and consequences are of lower entry into homeownership from these young buyers. What the paper does is to come up with two main results. So the first result is that I document new facts on these young home buyers in a panel of US metro areas. I show that there is, in fact, tremendous regional heterogeneity in the extent to which young home buyers delayed entry, with this delaying, this lower entry, being primarily concentrated in regions with higher house prices. This is striking because, on the other hand, mortgage standards, which historically condition access to homeownership, have changed uniformly nationwide. That is, there's been a nationwide contraction in mortgage standards, while on the other hand, this delaying, this lower entry has been primarily happening in regions with higher house prices. I will therefore argue that the data lends empirical support to a novel transmission channel of credit supply shocks by which credit constraints for young buyers bind regionally. What's the idea for this mechanism? So the idea is going to be that because of pre-existing differences in local house prices, young buyers' credit constraints bind more in regions with higher house prices. Young buyers, because of their position in the life cycle, have low wealth and low income. Therefore, they rely more on mortgages to buy home. That's going to be even more the case in regions with higher house prices. Therefore, even when credit standards contract nationwide identically, young buyers are going to respond disproportionately in regions with higher house prices and delay homeownership more in these regions. Therefore, this channel is going to be able to explain qualitatively why this decrease in young homeownership is coming primarily from regions with higher house prices. The second contribution of the paper will be to devise, calibrate, and estimate, and so primarily calibrate and estimate a structural model of regional housing and rental markets to quantify the strength of this channel. The key features of the model are going to be relative to the existing literature that housing and rental markets are going to be in general equilibrium, that is, the distribution of house prices and rents will respond to local and aggregate shocks. Households will be mobile across regions, that is, they will also be able to respond by migrating between regions in response to local shocks. And finally, cohorts of home buyers will be different, and I will focus in particular on the millennial cohort. This framework, which is new, will allow us, on the one hand, to map macrofinance models with a rich stochastic and dynamic structure, but which typically abstract from spatial variations, with, on the other hand, regional panel data, which have been heavily used in finance for empirical identification. Think about the Mian and Sufi kind of literature, but which have little to say on general equilibrium and welfare effects. What I will do is calibrate the model using regional panel data with indirect inference techniques, and then run a series of counterfactual experiments on these missing home buyers to evaluate the causes and the consequences of delayed homeownership from these guys. The main results are going to be that in the short run, I find that the dynamics of homeownership, both in the aggregate and in the cross-section, is explained by the heterogeneous impacts of an aggregate credit contraction, which is the same across regions. More specifically, I find that a uniform tightening of loan-to-value and payment-to-income standards explains not only the aggregate decrease in homeownership, but also the differential bursts in young homeownership across regions. I find then that in the long run, differences between cohorts persistently decrease the homeownership rate of millennials. And in particular, the specific characteristics of millennials, such as student debt and the persistent negative effect on earnings of graduating during the recession, persistently decrease their homeownership rate. However, I find that there are heterogeneous effects across regions of these factors, and in particular, these factors tend to decrease the owner-occupied housing markets in high-price regions, but on the other hand, to boost low-price regions and rental markets. Then turning to the policy implications of this regionally binding credit constraint channel, I'll show that these differences between regions dampen the effectiveness of subsidies to first-time buyers. Intuitively, why is that? If you give a subsidy that is the same across regions, then you're going to end up stimulating regions with higher house prices by less than regions with lower house prices, because it's not the same to give $2,000 to a home buyer in Ohio and to give $2,000 to a home buyer in San Francisco. The person in Ohio is much more likely to respond to that subsidy. I'll find, therefore, that place-based subsidies can substantially improve the effectiveness of policies that aim to stimulate first-time buyers. I'll skip the literature in the interest of time. Let me explain what I'm going to do in this talk. So I'll first document a series of motivating facts on young home buyers. Then I'll write down an equilibrium model of regional housing markets to quantify the strength of this new credit channel that I document, study the effect of a credit shock in the short run and in the long run, and then the effect of housing stimulus policies by focusing on the first-time homebuyer credit. All right, so let me jump into these new facts on young home buyers. So one of the reasons that we know relatively little about first-time buyers is that there's an empirical challenge, which is that it's very hard to find data on the mortgage standards for young buyers. because on the one hand, age is a borrower level variable, which is only in borrower level data, while mortgage standards are loan level data, and those are typically separate variables. So to circumvent and address this challenge, what I do is look at data on first-time home buyers instead. So first-time home buyers in the US, on average, are 32, 33 years old. The first-time homebuyer variable is a variable that's both in borrower and in loan level data. More specifically, what I do is build a panel of US metro areas that spans 15 years broadly around the Great Recession. I merge several sources at the MSA level. So first, on mortgage origination, I use the CCP Equifax panel from the New York Fed. On mortgage standards, I use the single family loan level data sets from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. For house prices and rents, I use Zillow. And for demographics and housing data, I use data from the American Community and Housing Surveys. What I do next in the remaining of the paper is to sort regions into, on the one hand, low price regions in blue. So think of Detroit to fix ideas, and high price regions in red. Think of San Francisco to fix ideas. So what I'm going to do next is hold this classification of regions fixed throughout both the empirical part and the model part, and I will then compare them. Importantly, the sorting of regions is done prior to the recession and prior to the boom. So think about regions that are high price, say in 2000 or 2005, and regions which are low price in 2000 or 2005. These are the same regions, so the identity of the regions is fixed throughout the doc. Then what do we learn about first-time buyers? The first point that I want to document is that there's an important divergence in young home ownership rates between regions after the recession. What happens in particular? The blue lines represent regions in the bottom of the house price distribution. And you can see that the lower in the bottom of the house price distribution regions are, the less homeownership falls for these young households after the recession. In contrast, if you look at in red regions that are in the top of the house price distribution, you see that the homeownership rate of young households drops up to 25% after the recession. What I'm going to do next is just to look at the top 50% of the regions in the house price distribution. Those are going to be the regions in red, and the bottom 50% of the regions in the house price distribution, those are going to be the region in blue. If you look at those regions, then we can see that this decrease in young home ownership is a lot coming from a decrease in entry into home ownership, which comes from a decrease in first-time mortgage originations. In low-price regions, mortgage originations drop by only 20%, while in high-price regions, they drop by more than 50%. Subsequently, there's delaying in the age of first-time buyers across regions after the recession. Why is that? Because people are delaying buying houses after the recession. Particular, if you look at the average age of first-time buyers in high-price MSAs, after the Great Recession, you see that it increases, a sign that people are buying homes later in their life cycles, while it decreases in low-price regions. Why does it decrease in low-price regions? Probably as a response to the first-time homebuyer credit, which was implemented exactly during this period. Why does the first-time homebuyer credit have no effect on high-price regions? That's something that the model will explain and to which I already hinted. All right, now looking at mortgage standards, which typically condition access to home ownership, while there is a lot of regional heterogeneity in the extent to which young home buyers delay buying, or in the extent to which entry into home ownership decreases, we can see that it's not the case at all for loan characteristics and mortgage standards across regions. They co-vary super strongly. So if you look at credit scores, credit score requirements increased uniformly across low price and high price regions after the Great Recession, which means a tightening in credit standards. Similarly, payments to income ratios also decreased after the Great Recession, very simultaneously across high price and low price regions, and the same for loan to value ratios. That's puzzling because you might think if young buyers delay homeownership more in high price regions, it might come from a stronger tightening of credit standards in high price regions. And it turns out it's not so much the case. Let me give you the intuition for why it may not be the case and the intuition behind the main channel, which will explain this phenomenon. Think about a very standard and simple mortgage contract with a mortgage interest rate RB, maybe 5%, maturity N, 30 years, and some mortgage standards for loan to value, payment to income ratios. Now think of a representative borrower with an income Y. If you take the mortgage payment formula, which tells you as a function of your principal, how much you're going to pay every month on your mortgage, and you invert this formula, then you get the maximum loan size that you can afford based on your payment to income constraint. You can also invert the LTV formula and get the maximum loan size that you can afford based on the LTV constraint. Combining both of these maximum loan sizes give you the maximum price of a home that you can afford. What I'm going to do next is take time series for all these parameters from the data. So mortgage rate, maturity, lending standards, and the income of a representative household in the US, and as well as the down payments. What I'm going to do is plot these maximum affordable prices in high price and in low price regions and compare them with the actual price of housing in those regions. Get the following picture when you do that, and there are essentially three takeaways. The first one is that the maximum affordable price, which is the dashed line, is higher in high price regions than in low price regions. Why is it higher? Well, because people typically are richer and earn higher incomes in high price regions, so they're able to afford more expensive homes. Second takeaway, which is the most important, is that the maximum affordable price, the dashed line, is much closer to the actual price of housing, the solid line, in high price regions than in low price regions, which means that credit constraints bind a lot more in high price regions than in low price regions. The third takeaway is that there is a strong covariance between the maximum affordable price and the actual price of housing, especially in high price regions, which again seems to suggest that variations in equilibrium house prices are driven to a large extent by variations in credit standards. This is the intuition for this regionally binding credit constraint channel, which qualitatively seems to be able to explain why the decrease in young home ownership is mostly coming from high price regions. However, these simple calculations ignore many things which are relevant for housing markets. In particular, they ignore heterogeneity. I've been looking at the income of an average borrower, while there's a lot of heterogeneity along the income dimension. They ignore the option to rent as well. If credit constraints are binding, you could rent instead of owning, and therefore it may not translate into a decrease in local house prices. It also ignores the possibility that households can migrate. That is, if credit constraints are more binding in high price MSAs, you can just migrate to a lower price MSA where credit constraints are less binding. And finally, these graphs do not allow to disentangle the effect of local versus aggregate shocks. This is what I'm going to do next is write down a model to try to quantify all these various aspects. Let me give you the one slide summary of the model without equation. The model is going to be a model with overlapping generations of heterogeneous households with a life cycle and incomplete markets, which is going to allow me to think about young constrained home buyers. The second building block of the model will be a regional heterogeneity. There will be a cross-section of housing markets, which I will summarize into a low price and a high price region, which I will map to the data. What are the dimensions along which these two regions will differ? First dimension will be construction costs. The second dimension will be the price elasticity of housing supply. And the third dimension will be amenities. All those will be parameters that are calibrated to match differences, local differences in housing markets. What I'm going to do next is subject the model to local and aggregate shocks. First to income, and second to mortgage standards, which will apply to long-term debt. In particular, I'll look at a tightening of loan-to-value, payment-to-income constraints, and an increase in mortgage origination fees, which will allow me to match the decrease in household leverage in the data during that period. Again, the key features of the model, which are novel relative to the existing literature, is that the dynamics of local house prices and rents is fully endogenous. That is, they completely respond to local and aggregate shocks. Households are mobile and can move across regions, potentially to escape binding borrowing constraints. And finally, cohorts are different. And I focused on two important determinants of access to homeownership for millennials, which are initial income and wealth. I then solved for the full transition dynamics of the model in response to these local and aggregate shocks, which I've mentioned. For the calibration, I want you to focus on essentially two things. So first, at the aggregate level, what I do is calibrate student debt to the average student debt level in the consumer credit panel. That is, millennials at the beginning of their lives come with a lower net asset position that is due to reimbursing existing student debt. Second thing is that because they graduate during the Great Recession, I extend existing estimates of the persistent negative effects of graduating in a recession. I extend these estimates to the Great Recession and find that the earnings of millennials 15 years down the road are still 12.5% lower than had they not graduated during the Great Recession. Now, coming to the regional dimension, the two things which are different. So there are three things which differ between regions, as I mentioned. First one is the elasticity of housing supply, which I take from the classical size paper. This elasticity is lower in the high price region, which means that in response to a shock, prices will adjust more in high price regions and quantity less than in low price region. Second one is the cost of residential investment. So it's more costly to build in a high price region on Miami Beach than it is to build in Ohio. The third one is the amenity benefits. And finally, there are some specific benefits to homeownership. Model fits the data quite well by a construction of the calibration method. So the price per unit of housing is exactly matched. The rents are closely matched and the homeownership rates are matched. The model generates also income differences between regions and importantly, differences in price to income ratios. In the data, the price to income ratio is substantially higher in high price regions than in low price regions. What does it mean? It means that despite differences in house price levels, there is a limited amount of sorting in the data between low price and high price regions. Why is there a limited amount of sorting between these regions? Well, you can live in a region in which owning a home is expensive, but you can rent in the model. And therefore, this is why you do not need to have a high income to live in that region. The second thing is that there are mobility costs between regions. So even if you wanted to own a home in a region in which housing is expensive, perhaps it's costly for you to move across regions and you are stuck in that region. Therefore, the differences in income, in other words, are less than the differences in house prices. Why is that important? It's important because it means that constraints will be a lot more binding in high price regions because people cannot escape these constraints. And that's important for the reaction of the model of the economy to an aggregate credit shock. So what I'll do in the remaining of the talk is subject the model to a uniform transitory shocks to credit supply, to credit standards. In other words, I'll reverse engineer the parameters of the model for loan to value and payment to income constraints, which allow me to match the decrease in household leverage in the data. And I find that as in the data, this aggregate tightening of mortgage standards, which is the same across regions, like in the data, generates a decrease in homeownership that matches the data not only in the aggregate, but also in the cross section. This is what these graphs are showing for high price regions in red and for low price regions in blue. Again, I want you to take away three things from these graphs. First, the decrease in aggregate homeownership, as in the data, is mostly coming from a decrease in young homeownership rather than a decrease in old homeownership. Model is solid lines, data is dashed lines. Second, among young homeowners, the decrease in young homeownership is mostly coming from high price regions in red rather than from low price regions in blue. And third point, in terms of persistence, the model predicts that the effect is a lot more persistent in high price regions than in low price regions. From which credit constraints are these decreases coming from? Well, what you can do is plot the share of credit constraint buyers in each region and decompose it between loan to value constraints and payment to income constraints. While I do find that loan to value constraints were the constraints that were more binding for the youngest buyers in the economy, I also find that payment to income constraints are still important for young buyers, and especially in high price regions, which sort of nuances the classical media narrative that young home buyers were mostly limited by down payment or loan to value constraints. Here I show that payment to income constraints are also important for first-time buyers, not for the very youngest, but still they are important for middle-aged buyers. All right, so in the remaining time that I'll have, I'll discuss first what the effect of millennial characteristics are on housing markets. I'll discuss these effects mostly in the long run. So what I do here is compute a counterfactual economy where millennials have essentially no student debt and did not graduate during a worse initial labor market. This allows me to compute with this counterfactual the effect of these two factors. What I find is that in the baseline model, these two factors persistently lower young homeownership because they slow down wealth accumulation for millennials. They lower it persistently, indeed, by 6 percentage points, which is substantial. However, and again, nuancing the traditional media narrative, I find that the effect of graduating during the recession on house prices is much larger than the effect of student debt, which here is more minor. Another outcome of the model is that these two factors have very heterogeneous impacts on housing markets. First one is that while student debt and a worse initial labor market depress the owner-occupied market in high-price regions, they boost the owner-occupied market in low-price regions. Why is that? It's because young home buyers who cannot buy in high-price regions relocate to lower-price regions. Think of young buyers migrating from San Francisco to Austin, Texas, or to North Carolina, thereby boosting these local markets. Second thing is that the effects also of these factors are heterogeneous across sectors. For those households who do not migrate to lower price regions, those households stay longer on the rental market and rent nicer and larger rentals. And therefore they boost the rental markets and local rents. Think of the 30, 40-year-old millennials who cannot buy in Williamsburg in New York, but rent very nice condos and boost the local rents. All right, now what are the effects of regionally binding credit constraints on housing stimulus policies and in particular on the effect of the first-time homebuyer credit. Let me tell you first what the first-time homebuyer credit was. It was an $8,000 subsidy, which was implemented during the Great Recession around 2008, 2009 to stimulate housing markets. What the model here delivers is actually bad news, is that regional heterogeneity dampens the effectiveness of this subsidy for two reasons. Again, as I mentioned earlier, think about an $8,000 subsidy that's uniform across regions. That's essentially a one-size-fits-all subsidy. However, this subsidy is going to boost housing demand relatively a lot less in high-priced regions than in low-priced regions. And again, think of the intuition of giving $8,000 to a first-time buyer in San Francisco versus giving $8,000 to a first-time buyer in Detroit. The second effect, the second reason why regional heterogeneity dampens the effectiveness of these subsidies is that in the model, people simply prefer living in high-priced regions. So what you're doing—
You need to wrap up in 1 minute. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. So what you're doing essentially when you're giving such a subsidy is that you are subsidizing homeownership in places where people ex ante prefer not so much living, thereby limiting the aggregate welfare effect of these subsidies. Therefore, when you do instead place-based subsidies and index subsidies to local prices, make them proportional, but in a budget neutral way, instead of giving the same dollar subsidy everywhere, you get larger and more persistent welfare gains. So what this suggests is that at the end of the day, perhaps the design of housing stabilization policies should account for local house price differences and regional preferences that may be different across locations, which is a conclusion that might be different from ones for labor market stimulus policies, where people typically might want to stimulate places with more deteriorated, if you will, labor markets. All right, so that's it. So let me conclude. I think I'm out of time. So what I do in this paper is to sort of try and develop a regional macrofinance approach to link, on the one hand, dynamic stochastic models to regional panel data on the other hand. So what I do here is use a panel of metro areas on first-time buyers and show an equilibrium model of regional housing and rental markets to show that regionally binding credit constraints affect first-time buyers a lot in the short run, in the long run, but they also affect the policy, the effectiveness of policies that aim to stimulate first-time buyers. There are many more results in the paper, right? I'd be happy to talk about that more, and I look forward to the discussant comments.
Yes, okay, so we're behind schedule, so let's invite the discussant for this paper. Thanks, Pierre, for the presentation. So let's invite Zhang from Peking University to discuss this paper.
Thanks a lot, Professor Chen, for inviting me to discuss this paper. Thanks, Pierre, for the great presentation. So this paper studied a very important research question. As we can see from this graph, there's a dramatic dynamics of the homeownership rate in the United States. And as we can see, the homeownership rate is now lower than what was before the Great Recession and the boom bust cycle, even though house prices has now come higher than the peak of the Great Recession, before the Great Recession. So the question is why, right? And there is a lot of kind of discussion and debate in even the popular press about the decline in the homeownership rate in the United States. As we can see from this graph, the homeownership decline is across the board, but it's much larger for the young group that this paper focused on. And this is not only really a kind of age problem, this is also kind of a cohort problem. As you can see from this graph, each cohort we have a name on, the baby boomers, the Gen X, the millennials, they have what is seen a lower homeownership rate at comparable ages than their previous cohorts. So there's a lot of questions to be studied here. In this paper, the main fact is a slump in young homeownership rate is really driven by high price cities. So we focus on the majority of the decline, which is the young, and then a new fact in this paper is that this is really driven by half of the cities. And then after establishing the fact, the model really puts forward an explanation that's quite easy to understand once you go through the setup. The explanation is really that the high price cities is not only high price, but it's more high price to income. And we have price to income, when you have payment to income constraints, then the payment to income constraints are going to buy more in high price regions. Also in the data, Pierre finds that the high price cities, the income is very procyclical. So when the Great Recession hits, not only does income decline, but it declines even more than the average. So the payment to income ratio binds more there. It also tightens more there in the recessions. And that's the reason for the greater decline of the home ownership rate in the high price regions. Now the model is very rich, so it also allows to study kind of scarring effect of the unemployment in the Great Recession, as well as student debt, and that amplifies its explanation. So I think this paper is wonderful, and this paper shows that housing research has really gone a long way in the last 20 years. Why do I say that? Because 20 years ago, we were also interested in very similar questions. And Otaro, Magne, and Rady, who in 2006 had another restart paper, they were studying sort of the similar things. In the UK, 20 years ago, they went through the same cycle. So credit constraints loosened, home ownership for the young increased, and then credit constraints tightened and home ownership for the young decreased. But in their paper, they only really offer a very limited explanation based on a very simple theory model. They couldn't do quantitatives with it. They could not do heterogeneity across regions, right? So this paper is really adding in all the things that we celebrate in the last 20 years: heterogeneous agent, life cycle models, idiosyncratic as well as aggregate shocks. And what's more important, it has spatial equilibrium, so people can choose where to migrate. Now, I just have 3 comments. One comment is the price to rent ratio. So the first moment I think about this question, the thing that jumps into my mind is price to rent, because when we compare kind of relative cost of owning and renting, it seems like price to rent is the first thing you would look at. This is coming from an empirical perspective. In a model, you also have amenities and other preference for owning versus renting. So that's not in the price to rent ratio. But I think still the price to rent ratio may be meaningful. The model has implications, but the price to rent ratio doesn't really have a lot of kind of stress in the graph. So I think it's worth kind of just looking at this quantity. What's more specific in my point about price to rent is that the period after the Great Recession is also a period that have seen a lot of out-of-town demand. And out-of-town demand has been one of the forces that has been pushing up house prices after the Great Recession, making it reaching the peak despite kind of no loosening in credit constraint. Papers looking at out-of-town demand has found that out-of-town demand will influence the price to rent ratio, and that could also be a factor driving the home ownership rate low secularly. So is there any need to think about kind of out-of-town demand on the decline in the young home ownership rate? That's kind of my second comment. My third comment is about the preference for amenities. So the urban literature has suggested that amenity benefits may be cohort and age dependent. What I mean is that the millennials and young, they seem to have a preference for large cities that are vibrant. For example, in a very recent study by a postdoc at Harvard, he finds that that really we see a larger increase in the share of people living in very large cities among the young people and among the millennials. And the urban literature has also found that the trends in city development has some association with this generation of millennials. This gentrification, so people moving from suburbs into the city centers, moving from maybe low price areas into high price areas. The urban literature sort of have suggestions about this could be due to a generational dependent taste for different areas. So this is not currently in the model. Currently in the model, different cohorts, they have the same preference across regions. They both prefer high price areas. However, I think given the current set of the model, because you already have parameters that depends on time, maybe it's feasible to think about kind of these possibilities. So my two last minor comment is one, so you have estimates of the regional sensitivities to income shocks. I think that's very interesting by itself. So the data is from the CBF, but I don't see which years. So maybe just giving some more information would be helpful. As well as kind of, you're now estimating the sensitivities of the entire sample period and using that beta in the calibration, in the counterfactual for the Great Recession. Maybe it's also useful to see whether that beta is the same in the Great Recession relative to the entire sample period. Coming back to period length, so the model now has a period being 4 years. Given that after a Great Recession, we only have like 3 periods, maybe it's worth looking into kind of the period length, because we know that, for example, in most papers, if you have discrete time versus continuous time, that matters for how people can save potentially out of borrowing constraints. So something along that direction may be useful to think about the robustness of the findings. But overall, I think this paper is very impressive, both technically as well as in its kind of relevance, and represents the state of the art in the housing literature. I think it's a very clever setting of the model. And I think it can be applied in many new papers by maybe Pierre as well as many other people. And I totally enjoyed reading it and learned a lot. And I wish Pierre best of luck in the publication process. That's all. Thank you.
Thanks a lot to you. Pierre, do you want to take a couple of minutes to respond to the discussion?
Yes, definitely. So thanks a lot, you, for the thoughtful discussion. Very, very helpful. First, yeah, I want to clarify that. So the period length is 4 years, but there are 20 periods in the model. That is, households live for 80 years. So they do have time to save out of the borrowing constraints. That's one of the major forces that I seek to quantify, actually. So now, when it comes to the price to rent ratio, I definitely agree with you. That's an important moment to match when it comes to home ownership. So the model matches it in steady state. Now, in the data, price to rent ratios typically follow the dynamics of house prices because rents are pretty stable. So the model matches that as well. What the model does not have, and I agree that's an important point, is the effect of potentially external investors on these price to rent ratios, these out-of-town buyers. I think that's an important force, especially in cities like New York or Vancouver, Toronto, cities like that. So that's something that could be incorporated. Now, of course, we would need an additional moment to discipline the calibration of that. Yeah, and finally, amenities could be made, again, dependent on age and income. So that would be easy to do, but then I would again require another moment to think of what this parameter is driving. And so given that the model for now matches migrations across regions without making it age and income specific, you can see that as, like restricting the number of free parameters, but yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions? If anyone in the audience have any questions, please feel free to speak up. Okay, I guess also like it's approaching the end of the program. People are also getting tired. But let me just express a great deal of thanks to both Pierre and you for the great presentation and discussion of all the presenters and discussants in this session. It's a wonderful program. So I hope you all enjoyed it. And there's one more session that's coming, remaining for the real estate and urban economics. I hope to see as many of you there as well. So yeah, I think that's probably it. I'd like to conclude this session, and I wish everyone a good evening or good afternoon.
Thanks
Thank you
Thank you
all.
very much.